Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. As elusive as the Loch Ness Monster, but maybe not as famous, is a legendary sea serpent said to inhabit the waters of the Pacific Northwest. Today, there has been no actual hard evidence that this sea monster exists, but that might have just changed. 2009, Nushagak Bay, Alaska. Salmon fisherman Kelly Nash is on a boat with his sons, Jason and Kyle, when suddenly they spot unusual movement in the water next to them and start recording this video. The shaky black and white footage shows what appears to be a long, dark, serpentine creature with humps on its back, moving rapidly through the water.
Now watch, its head's gonna pop out. Check this out.
Oh, it's blue.
Let's look at that again. Kelly estimates the massive creature to be about 20 to 30 feet long. While this footage is curiously unique, it may actually be showing us a clearer view of a legendary creature, a cryptid as they're known, that's been widely reported before. Field researcher Ken Gerhardt explains.
Cadborosaurus, or Caddy, is a mysterious sea creature that's been reported off the coast of Pacific North America. The name is associated with the location where it's most been seen, which is Cadboro Bay, British Columbia. Cadborosaurus is generally described as an immense serpentine animal, anywhere from 60 to 100 feet in length, with a horse-like head, sharp fish-like teeth, giant forward-facing eyes.
There have been more than 300 sightings of Caddy over the past 200 years, including one case in the 1930s that may have produced actual physical evidence of the creature.
During the summer of 1937, off the coast of British Columbia, there was a strange animal that was found in the stomach of a sperm whale. This animal popped out that was snake-like in form, had a horse-like head, 2 flippers, and a fluke tail. The man in charge actually had these workers take some photographs of it. Subsequently, this became known as the Naden Harbor carcass. In my opinion, this is the same animal that we see in this video. But there are other theories as well, that perhaps we could be looking at a primitive type of snake-like whale known as a basilosaur.
The basilosaur, or Basilosaurus, was a fearsome predatory whale which swam the oceans nearly 40 million years ago. And while scientists first described this as a giant reptile, further research determined it to be a marine mammal, one that could grow up to 65 feet in length. Could this be the same creature?
There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitness accounts, so I think that we could build a pretty strong case that this animal really does exist.
Right after this video was revealed, 2 Cadborosaurus researchers went to visit the Nash family, who shot this footage. They claimed the creature fully lifted its head out of the water and even turned to face their camcorder. But of course, that piece of evidence isn't on this recording. Let's see what our experts have to say about the evidence that remains. We first wanted to check the authenticity of this tape, so we brought it to forensic video analyst Michael Primo.
This video has indications that it was enhanced. It has processing done to enlarge it as well as stabilize it. There's too many unknown variables here to actually arrive at some sort of accurate conclusion. Because the video has been enhanced.
So there's already a red flag. But to be fair, we spoke with marine biologist Shay Steingass. She first looks at this creature's possible connection with the prehistoric Basilosaurus.
I don't think that's what we're looking at, because the body type of the basilosaur was actually pretty solid. It wasn't a snake-like animal.
However, Steingass believes this creature does have more in common with the marine mammal Basilosaurus than the supposed reptile corpse from Naden Harbor.
Nushagak Bay is part of a polar Arctic environment, very cold environments to live in. It's very unlikely that any kind of reptile-like animal, especially this size, would be existing in Nushagak Bay. The animals that thrive here are typically either fish, invertebrates that live on the bottom, or marine mammals. There's really no reptiles or snakes that this could be mistaken for.
Many online critics claim we are just looking at some piece of trash or floating debris. But the dozens of tech people and fishermen who have studied this video can't explain how debris could move in such an organic way. Other skeptics have suggested this could be a formation of seals, or possibly a known giant animal like an oarfish or a giant eel. But surprisingly, Steingass is doubtful.
The oarfish has these beautiful dorsal fins that help them be more hydrodynamic as they swim. And we don't see that here. This animal doesn't really seem to have any clear anatomy. Another really popular theory is that this is some kind of a giant eel. And frankly, there's no species of eel that would be quite this size in Nushagak Bay.
And as far as seals go, Steingass says it's unlikely, since seals don't typically swim in linear groups, nor would they keep their heads submerged while exposing other parts of their body. So with all of these potential possibilities ruled out, does Steingass have any idea what this is? Unfortunately, like many who have chased Caddy's tail, she's stumped.
This is really interesting footage, and part of the charm of it for me is that it's difficult to tell exactly what we're looking at. So this might be one of those classic sea monster videos that's going to stick around for a long time.
Our verdict? Possible cryptid. If the video is legit, and yes, that's an if, whatever this thing is has stumped our ace marine biologist. People have been looking at this footage since 2009, and to this day, it remains a mystery. But you can be sure, if any more footage of Caddy comes our way, you'll see it here first. Now let's head south to Texas and back in time to the 1950s. UFO mania is in high gear, especially in Lubbock, the site of a peculiar phenomenon that is still being debated today. August 31st, 1951. 18-year-old Carl Hart Jr. has his bed pushed next to an open window in his Lubbock, Texas home. He's waiting for a strange recurring phenomenon he'd read about in the papers. Suddenly, it appears. Hart grabs his camera and runs out into the backyard to capture the stunning sight. A V-shaped formation of 15 to 30 lights appears in the night sky. Eyewitnesses say the lights were bluish-green in color, traveling silently overhead from north to south. The lights then disappeared, only to reappear a few minutes later. Writer Amy Title says Carl's sighting wasn't the first time these lights were witnessed.
5 days earlier, on August 25th, the same formation appeared in the sky in view of 3 college professors, one of which was an engineer and another was a physicist. If any group of people had the skills to figure out what this was, it was that group.
After that first sighting, the professors would often observe these lights 2 or 3 times a night for the next few weeks before they disappeared forever. Despite no shortage of eyewitnesses, Carl was the only one able to successfully capture the lights on film.
Carl Hart was ultimately interrogated by the U.S. Air Force and eventually the FBI as part of Project Blue Book.
Project Blue Book was the code name for the systematic study of UFOs by the U.S. Air Force from 1947 to 1969.
Lieutenant Edward Ruppelt, who was the lead investigator on Project Blue Book, also got in on Hart's story. He looked at the negatives of the photographs and determined they were authentic and untampered with.
Project Blue Book reviewed over 12,000 cases. About 700 of them were determined to be genuine UFOs, including the Lubbock lights. However, Lieutenant Ruppelt also conducted his own investigation and later claimed to have learned what caused the Lubbock lights. But don't get excited just yet.
On the condition that he remain anonymous, a scientist confided in Ruppelt that these lights were actually consistent with a naturally occurring phenomenon. Ruppelt kept the secret of what the natural phenomenon is because he realized that any discussion or any information would lead people back to the scientist.
So while Ruppelt may have had an answer, as far as we're concerned, the Lubbock lights remain an unsolved mystery.
No one knows exactly what these lights are, and many question that Ruppelt ever had an anonymous scientific source. Whatever this naturally occurring phenomena is, it has eluded other scientists for decades.
This isn't your typical UFO sighting. This happened multiple times a night over 2 weeks, and hundreds of people saw it. But we still don't have confirmation of what it was, unless you believe Lieutenant Ruppelt really did have an anonymous source who figured it out. Let's see if our experts can shed some light on this mystery. First, we had astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy analyze a popular theory that the lights were actually plovers, migrating birds local to Lubbock, that were reflecting the street lights below them.
Birds generally aren't going to be reflective enough to shine this brightly at night. I've photographed birds at night many times. They never show up as brighter than the surrounding sky. The birds are always silhouetted. These lights were incredibly bright.
Others speculate that these were secret military craft, but military aviation expert Tim McMillan has his doubts.
If we are to assume that each of the points of light that are on the photograph are an individual aircraft, that would suggest that these would be aircraft that are extremely densely packed together, far more so than what would be safe in conventional airborne operations. And so it leads me to believe that we're not looking at individual planes.
Perhaps then this was one aircraft with several lights? But according to Ruppelt's independent investigation, the Lubbock lights were thought to be flying at an altitude of only 800 to 1,000 feet, just a fraction of the height of a standard commercial aircraft. McMillan says any plane at that altitude should have been heard as well as seen.
Eyewitnesses said that they didn't hear any noise. The idea that you would be able to do that silently, it's not consistent with the technology we have today, much less in 1951.
What about Ruppelt's anonymous scientist? He claimed the Lubbock lights were, quote, a very commonplace and easily explainable natural phenomenon. We asked meteorologist Juan Hernandez what that could possibly refer to.
I can confidently say this is not meteorological. The reports say that this happened over and over continuous days. That is unlike weather. The wind conditions, the temperature, all that is going to change on a day-to-day basis. It's not astronomical either. Whether we're talking about meteors or comets, objects from outer space never fall in perfect formation.
Which, of course, leaves only one more option.
Whether or not it's out of this world, that's not for me to decide.
Our verdict, the same as Project Blue Book's. We're calling this a genuine UFO, at least until Lieutenant Ruppelt's anonymous source is revealed, along with his explanation. Okay, imagine being at home and there's a massive diesel truck idling right next door. The noise might bother you, but it'll be gone soon. Well, to some Canadians, a similar idling sound remained just that, idling for nearly a decade. 2011, Windsor, Ontario, Canada, right across the river from Detroit, Michigan. Toronto-based filmmaker Adam Makarenko has set out to document a mysterious phenomenon, when you hear rather than see. As Adam films the dark green foliage in the Ojibwe Nature Reserve, a persistent noise can be heard in the background. Listen closely. That's what's known as the Windsor hum, a constant low-frequency sound whose origin is unknown.
It was like this X-file that no one could solve. No one knew where it was coming from. But you kind of feel it more than you hear it. It was shaking people's houses. People were moving away. So it had all these things to it that really intrigued me.
Adam starts investigating. His first suspect? The 2 Windsor salt mines. They produce millions of tons of salt each year, 85% of which goes to de-icing roads across Canada.
So I went there and I did a little bit of an investigation. Salt mines said, no, it's not us. We're not creating the noise.
Canada's government is also on the case. And in September of 2011, the Ministry of Natural Resources releases its readings from seismometers, instruments that respond to ground noises.
When they did the test, they determined that it was airborne, so that it wasn't coming from the ground.
The investigation then turns to a funky place with a funky name, Zug Island. It's an old steel manufacturing site on the U.S. side of the Detroit River that only became an island when car magnate Henry Ford built a shipping canal around it in the 1920s.
No one can access it. The police can't go on the island.
That's right. Today, access to Zug Island is restricted, its activities undisclosed, and the entire compound is said to be under Homeland Security protection. Journalist Alexis Brooks says this is why some call it Detroit's Area 51.
When you have an area that's a secret, Homeland Security involved, you have to wonder if there was something defense-oriented going on there, and there could have been a hum that was emanating from that process.
What's even more mysterious is it's only the Canadians, not the Americans, who hear the hum. Yet the U.S. government won't cooperate with its northern neighbor on an investigation. And researchers have never been granted access to Zug Island. So the question still remains, where does the hum come from? The salt mines deny it, but could they unknowingly be the source of the sound? The mining process involves drilling holes into salt walls that are loaded with explosives to blast the rock salt, which is then crushed on conveyors. Audio analyst Rob Maher does a sound wave comparison.
This sound is a very low frequency sound, approximately 35 hertz, 35 cycles per second. The strongest frequencies in the underground mining is between 100 and 200 hertz. So it's at a higher frequency range, and there's not a lot of energy down in the range where we found the Windsor hum signal to be located.
The Windsor area has seen impressive growth in recent years, including the construction of the Windsor-Essex Parkway. So Maher considers if ground construction equipment could be emitting the hum.
The heavy construction vibration does have energy down in the 35 hertz range, but construction equipment would not be operating all the time, all day long for 10 years, and often the complaints about the hum were most common at night.
So Maher looks back to Zug Island to solve this rumbling riddle.
It seems most likely to me the sound is due to vibrations of the ground, so that the mechanical equipment across the river is causing a layer in the geological formations under the water to cause the ground to vibrate, sort of like a mini earthquake.
Another report from 2 Canadian universities in 2014 seems to point in that direction.
They determined that a likely cause was blast furnaces at the United States steel mills.
Though exactly what sort of steel these furnaces were smelting on Zug Island is still a mystery. The researchers believe the furnaces had been running at a higher than normal capacity. That was causing intense reverberations of the plant's metallic foundations, which propagated across the river until the mill was shut down.
The reports of the hum then petered out.
Our verdict? The hum was likely caused by now decommissioned blast furnaces on Zug Island. However, the occasional noise complaint still does pop up from time to time on social media, so maybe the hum is not quite so done after all. Eating honey, olive oil rub-downs, a good cigar every week. It seems like every elderly person has their own secret for extending our lives. But one man in Thailand may have actually cracked the code. Let's take a look. It's March 2022 in Western Thailand. A family is gathered around the bedside of a figure that barely looks alive. The man is a monk named Luang Pho Ayai, and he is very much alive. Look again. His skeletal figure and desiccated skin make it hard to believe this video is real, but it is.
Some people who've seen this video have wondered if this is the oldest man who has ever lived, guessing that his age is over 150 years old.
For the record, the oldest documented person in history was Jean Calment, who was born in 1875 and died in 1997 at an amazing 122 years old. So 150 years old would be a huge jump. But scientists say where a person lives can have an effect on how long they live.
Researchers are fascinated by so-called blue zones, which are geographical areas with a larger than average number of people who are 100 years old. By contrast, the average life expectancy in the United States is only 77 years old. Could the man in this video be benefiting from one of these so-called blue zones?
These blue zones don't share many similarities when it comes to geography, so their connection to longevity remains a mystery. But there's another possible explanation. a theory that some people can mummify themselves.
What this video brings to mind is the supposed Japanese practice of soku shinbutsu, which is the practice of self-mummification. Self-mummification is meditating so deeply that you pass away in that meditative state, becoming a preserved body. The practice is believed to have been observed by Buddhist monks who would practice a form of such extreme asceticism that their bodies would simply mummify themselves.
According to Atlas Obscura, between 1081 and 1903, at least 17 monks managed to mummify themselves. Is that astonishing ability what we're seeing here? The act of self-mummification was criminalized in Japan during the late 1800s as it was deemed inhumane by the government. So has this man revived the practice, or is he mastering some other form of self-preservation? We asked our experts. Could this man be gaining extended life by residing in one of the world's seemingly magical blue zones? Biologist Stephanie Menke says that's an easy no.
Being in a blue zone is not a factor that allows him to live this long. This is in Thailand. It's not in one of the blue zone areas.
So could we be looking at a real example of self-mummification in action? Menke is doubtful.
I don't think we're seeing self-mummification here. You know, that his skin has gone through a lot over time and his muscles have broken down and he's just aged. It appears he has plans to become cremated after he passes, so he's not attempting to become a shoku shinbutsu.
Menke believes this may be nothing more than a determined monk using a trained, focused mind to prolong the inevitable.
Your mind can actually have a great influence over your health. There's studies where monks have been able to actually change their internal core temperature by several degrees of Fahrenheit just through meditative states. I definitely think that mind over matter could have helped him live this long because he's been able to keep his stress so low, likely because of meditating.
Emergency physician Ed Hope thinks Luong's appearance and his advanced age, whatever it is, have to do with how much he eats.
Luong probably has a very modest diet, and he probably avoids some of those other things that might speed aging up, such as smoking and drinking alcohol.
Research backs up the hypothesis that calorie restriction slows down the aging process, but it can't prevent inevitable muscle breakdown known as sarcopenia.
So sarco means muscle and penia means a reduction of. So we're seeing a reduction of muscle mass. The cells he produces now aren't as good as the cells he's produced before. And that's why he's got this very frail appearance.
However, Hope says another factor might play an even bigger role here.
A human can only live so long, and that's really going to be defined by your personal genetics. He's certainly benefiting from good genetics as well. Not everyone, even if you live a very healthy life, will live as long as Luong here. The woman that's lived the longest, Jean Calmet, a French woman who lived to the age of 122, actually must have benefited from very good genetics because she was smoking all the way up to age 117.
And as far as Luong being the oldest living man at 150 years old, we dug into it. Ends up that's just a rumor that caught fire on the internet.
Sadly, Luong passed away due to advanced age at the age of 107.
Our verdict? We agree that what we are seeing is a man who extended his lifespan through disciplined eating and who benefited from good genetics. And while it ends up the rumors of Luong's life were greatly exaggerated, his surprising success on TikTok has, in a way, granted him a form of internet immortality. From banshees to Nessie, Scotland has no shortage of sightings of the curious and fantastic. But have you ever heard of a Scottish UFO? You're about to. It's November 2021, and a resident of the Maryhill section of Glasgow, Scotland, spots something curious in the sky. It appears he uses some kind of telescope to help him grab the image with his iPhone. The object glides in a deliberate path as the camera pans from gray clouds to orange skies. Take a look at this thing's unusual shape. It's vertically aligned, you can see that right here, with a narrow top that sure looks like a head. And then there's a larger middle section, and beneath that section, these two protrusions that look like legs or feet. Author Amy Title is well acquainted with Scottish UFO lore.
Perhaps the most famous incident was the Livingston incident in 1979. A forester was returning to his home when he saw a 20-foot diameter floating dome hovering above the ground in a clearing in the woods. He described it as being very dark gray in color with an outer flange and arms extending from the side of the vehicle that held propellers. When he returned home with ripped clothing and scratches over his body, his wife called the police to report a criminal assault. This remains the only UFO incident in the UK that was also treated as a criminal investigation.
But this object looks nothing like a floating dome. The vaguely humanoid appearance has some wondering if it could be some kind of piloted military tech.
The UK Royal Navy is responsible for investigating some new technologies, including jetpacks that are allowing pilots to fly between boats at sea using nothing but a jetpack strapped on their bodies.
The jetpacks can put out 1,000 horsepower, pushing the pilot to speeds of 85 miles per hour for 10 minutes.
So some might ask, is this one of these jetpacks being tested over Glasgow?
With such a long history of sightings, it comes as no surprise that Scotland is home to the SETI Post Detection Hub at St. Andrews University. Its purpose is to ensure that humanity will respond responsibly if and when we make first contact. Should these scientists roll out the welcome wagon? Our experts take a further look. First, does this object move like most UAPs? Rich Hoffman of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies has his doubts.
There's no observable means of propulsion. It makes no speed changes. You don't see any kind of control surfaces on it that would make it maneuver in a different direction or anything like that. We have no reported UAP sightings that would match anything like this right here.
Well, then does it move like a jetpack? Video analyst Mark D'Antonio argues that the limbs of a jetpack pilot constantly move and sway due to the thrust of the engines.
And we don't see that here at all. So I would remove jetpacks from contention here.
D'Antonio also argues that the humanoid shape of the object isn't very humanoid at all if you look closely enough.
This is a very good freeze frame because we actually can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 points on this. And what do you know that has 5 points? A 5-pointed star. So it's possible that we're looking at one or more star balloons.
But how could a balloon, of all things, maintain this steady flight?
The air can be thought of as like a river. If you're floating down a river, you're just gonna float on the river, and you're not gonna do much spinning around unless you reach a turbulent eddy around a big rock or something. In the same way, when we look in the air, an object flying through the air is going to maintain its same position unless it reaches a turbulent eddy of air. And so that's why we see it just drifting in the same exact position. So my best guess is that it is a specialty Mylar balloon that happens to be a 5-pointed star.
Our verdict, Mylar balloon. This sighting may have turned out to be a simple party favor, but that doesn't mean the end of our UFO watch. Scotland, we're not done with you yet. The game of pinball actually traces its roots back 7,000 years to a bocce-like game in ancient Egypt. It has been the subject of songs and movies. But now pinball is a star of a viral video, all because of a physics-defying high score. It's September 2022 near Austin, Texas. Local Renaissance Fair fire performer Alton Gass is celebrating his son's birthday at a pinball arcade where he's playing some of the classics.
I came across the Dr. Dude pinball machine and I decided to give it a whirl. The worst pinball game I have ever played. immediately tank the first 2 balls.
No need to cue the who. This guy's no pinball wizard. But then, Alton's lame game becomes so extraordinary that he has to memorialize it on film.
I don't know if I should feel bad or like I've done something fancy.
Check it out. We can see that a silver pinball seems to be ricocheting between a wall bumper and a round bumper over and over again. The ball shows no sign of slowing down or changing direction as the score tallies higher and higher.
You're the best pinball player ever.
Alton surpasses more than 1 million points without even trying.
I was just sitting there minding my business, and next thing I knew, it was just going, and it wouldn't stop, and I was amazed.
We are too, but it's just a pinball that got stuck, right? On the other hand, we've never seen this before. We've heard all kinds of wild theories for why this is happening, from telekinesis to magnets in the bumpers. But the most intriguing idea is that this man accidentally stumbled on one of history's most elusive concepts, perpetual motion.
Oh my gosh, perpetual motioning.
A perpetual motion machine is a hypothetical machine that once in motion stays in motion forever with no external energy source required. 12th century Indian mathematician Bhaskar II and 13th century French architect Villard de Honnecourt were among the first to try to design perpetual motion machines. Their idea was to create a wheel that would never stop moving. In 1900, renowned inventor Nikola Tesla got in on the action, proposing a self-acting device that would turn thermal energy into mechanical movement.
For hundreds of years, the perpetual motion machine has been tested in many forms, including the overbalanced wheel and closed-cycle water mill. And yet, to date, no one has succeeded. But could we be looking at a situation where perpetual motion has been proven?
What really gets me is that these pinball machines are designed specifically to avoid ball hang-ups that prevent the game from moving forward. But in this case, the ball kept going until someone bumped the machine. So how do you think Alton did it? Let's see if our experts can engage in some game theory. Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku analyzes if this could be the first successful, if accidental, perpetual motion machine.
In a closed system with no energy from the outside, that would be a perpetual motion machine. But here, energy comes from the outside. It is an open system, and that energy is from the plug. You pull the plug, and the whole thing shuts down.
The bumper is pushing the ball because it has an external energy source, in this case, electricity. So there's no evidence this pinball is in perpetual motion. In fact, the closest we've gotten so far to an actual perpetual motion machine is the Atmos clock, which is completely powered by atmospheric changes. But if this hang-up would eventually stop on its own, or at least by pulling the plug, then how did the ball end up in this strange situation?
The fact that the pinball came in at the exact angle that it did is crucial for this whole thing to work. In other words, I think it was an accident of engineering. The engineers who designed this thing did not realize that there was a sweet spot where if the ball came in at exactly this angle, the bumper would then create this circular motion essentially forever, as long as energy came in from the outside.
Legend says it's still bouncing to this day.
Our verdict? This isn't perpetual motion. The pinball is accidentally hitting the bumpers at a particular angle to keep it in play, and a design flaw in the machine allowed this to happen in the first place. Finally tonight, we've all seen snow in various forms. Flakes, flurries, showers. But have you ever seen snow in real life that looks like, well, like this, like packing peanuts? Check this out. November 2021, we're in Canada again, in the little hamlet of Mirror, Alberta. Some extreme weather is in the forecast, so Cheryl Martinez, a Philippine native living in Canada, is getting ready. As the storm begins, she opens the door to record, but what she sees isn't anything like what she expected. Little white pellets are pelting to the ground like a cascade of vanilla jujubes. As they build up, they don't look like your regular snowflakes or even hailstones.
It's my first time to see it, and we don't have that in Asia. Like a styrofoam rain, and it's amazing. It's beautiful.
Cheryl says it only lasts a few minutes and melts right away. So what's going on?
It looks like someone actually just took a shipping box and dumped all the styrofoam all over their yard. It's super strange.
So strange, in fact, that maybe this isn't natural, but rather man-made snow?
According to the World Meteorological Organization, 50 countries around the world practice cloud seeding, including the United States.
Cloud seeding is a weather manipulation tactic that involves seeding clouds with particles that water droplets cluster around to increase the chances the clouds will produce rain or snow that falls to the ground.
In the Beijing Olympics in 2008, the Chinese government actually claimed to have used cloud seeding to create rain in the days before the games, so the weather would actually be clear during the events themselves.
Another theory posits that this strange snow comes from alleged chemtrails sprayed down from the stratosphere.
The theory goes that the government is using chemtrails to release all kinds of chemicals with the goals of decreasing life expectancy, controlling minds, and controlling the weather. And that has led some to theorize that perhaps what we're looking at here are the remnants of a chemtrail experiment.
Or could it be that this styrofoam snow is actually styrofoam? Sounds absurd, right? Until you learn that it's actually happened.
In 2015 in New York City, there was an incident where tiny styrofoam pellets were blowing all over Midtown Manhattan. They were ending up in people's hair, in their beards, they were clogging gutters. According to one theory about that incident, the styrofoam pellets were coming from construction on the roof of a hotel.
Concerned New Yorkers called the mayor's office and the Department of Environmental Protection to try to get answers about this suspicious snow. And while the government never responded, the nearby Wyndham New Yorker Hotel denied any involvement. Back in Canada, we're hoping our experts can clear the air. Meteorologist Juan Hernandez examines if this could be cloud seeding.
With cloud seeding, we oftentimes see silver iodide being released into the clouds. The silver iodide acts as a cloud condensation nucleus where water droplets attach to the silver iodide, become heavy, and fall to the ground. It's used to bring rainfall to areas that don't receive enough rainfall. In this case, it's cold. Growing season is unlikely to be ongoing. Therefore, we just don't need weather manipulation in this case.
Hernandez says it's likely not hazardous chemtrail remnants either.
There is no reason to think that airplanes are indeed leaving behind chemtrails. Similar to what you see whenever your car is running outside and it's cold, we can say that the same thing is coming out of airplanes. It's exhaust, there's water vapor in there, and that's what we see. Water vapor condensing, and there is no residue or no soot that can be hazardous to any humans or any living organisms on the ground.
Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku explains why these perplexing pellets are not styrofoam.
Styrofoam is a plastic made out of chemicals like vinyl benzene and polystyrene. But it cannot be styrofoam because this object here melts. And therefore, we're not seeing plastic raining down from heaven.
So then, what is going on here?
What we're looking at here is a type of frozen precipitation. It's not hail, it's not snow, it's not sleet, it's graupel. Graupel forms whenever we have snowflakes that are coated with water. That water freezes onto the snowflake, a process called riming. If riming is particularly intense, those precipitation balls or graupel is quite large, about 0.2 of an inch.
This riming process fills in the snowflake's star shape, so it becomes a sphere by the time it reaches the ground.
The first time Caddy entered the collective imagination of the Pacific Northwest, it did so not as a roar or a spectacle, but as a whisper carried across cold water, a shape half seen and half denied. And this is where the film The Proof is out there begins to breathe like a living organism rather than a television investigation. Because it understands instinctively that belief is born not from evidence alone, but from atmosphere, from the long history of humans staring into dark water and feeling stared back at in return. And so the opening movement situates us along the coastlines of British Columbia, where mist settles like a deliberate veil, and the sea seems less a surface than a depth pretending to be calm. And here the idea of Cadborosaurus, affectionately shortened to Caddy by generations of locals, is not introduced as a monster, but as a neighbor, an uninvited yet strangely familiar presence whose absence would feel more unsettling than its return, and as the narration folds together archival photographs, grainy film, and the measured skepticism that the series is known for. The story of Caddy unfolds not in a straight line, but in a tide, advancing and retreating, each wave bringing with it a new eyewitness, a new chart, a new smudge of ambiguity that refuses to be wiped clean. And what makes this segment compelling is not the promise of revelation, but the disciplined patience with which it allows uncertainty to remain alive, because the proof is out there. Never rushes to kill a mystery. It dissects it slowly, respectfully, like a pathologist who understands that the body on the table once held a soul, and in this case that soul belongs as much to the witnesses as it does to the creature they claim to have seen. Fishermen hardened by decades at sea, who speak not with the language of fantasy, but with the weary precision of people accustomed to storms, currents, and the difference between a log and something that moves against the logic of waves. And the episode frames these testimonies in a way that avoids sensationalism, lingering instead on pauses, on the way hands gesture unconsciously when describing length, curvature, undulation, the rhythm of something alive, and here the idea of Cadborosaurus begins to take on a biological plausibility that is more dangerous to skepticism than any dramatic reenactment could ever be, because it suggests not a mythical serpent, but a surviving relic, a long-necked marine animal whose silhouette echoes prehistoric forms without demanding that we abandon modern science. And the title itself, truncated and teasing, Caddy the Cadborosaurus, the Lou, feels like an intentional act of restraint, a refusal to complete the thought for the viewer, inviting us instead to finish the sentence ourselves with whatever fears or fascinations we bring to the screen. And as marine biologists are introduced, the film does something subtle and deeply intelligent. It does not ask them to confirm the existence of Caddy, but to explain why such a creature would be unlikely, and then, crucially, why it would not be impossible. And in that narrow corridor between unlikely and impossible, the entire narrative sets up camp, building its fires, telling its stories, waiting to see who dares to step closer, and the discussion of oceanic blind spots, of sonar limitations in shallow coastal waters, of migratory patterns that still confound satellite tracking, all serve to undermine the comforting illusion that the sea has been fully mapped and mastered. And it is here that the proof is out there becomes less about Caddy specifically and more about the human need to draw borders around the unknown, to declare a line beyond which nothing new can exist. Because to accept Caddy is not merely to accept a creature, but to accept that our maps are provisional, our textbooks drafts rather than final editions. And this is an unsettling thought for a civilization that prides itself on data, and yet the show balances this discomfort with rigor, bringing in analysts who break down footage frame by frame, measuring wave frequency, comparing known animals, eliminating seals, otters, debris, and camera artifacts with a methodical calm that feels almost meditative. And what remains after these eliminations is not proof, but residue, a stubborn remainder that refuses to be categorized. And the film treats this remainder with respect rather than triumph, allowing the viewer to sit with it, to feel the weight of not knowing. And one of the most effective creative choices in this first part is the way sound is used, the low hum beneath interviews, the distant calls of seabirds, the soft slap of water against hulls, all reinforcing the sense that the environment itself is a participant in the story, a collaborator in concealment. And as the narrative moves into historical accounts, stretching back decades, even centuries, the figure of Caddy begins to feel less like an anomaly and more like a pattern, sightings clustered around specific inlets, recurring descriptions of humps and a horse-like head, the peculiar consistency of length estimates that hover within a narrow range, and this consistency becomes its own form of evidence. Not conclusive, but suggestive, like footprints that never quite reveal the shape of the foot, but insist on its presence. And the film is careful here not to romanticize the past, acknowledging that folklore often grows in the cracks of ignorance. Yet, it also reminds us that folklore is sometimes the first draft of science, a repository of observations waiting for the tools to be properly interpreted. And in this sense, Caddy becomes a metaphor for the entire enterprise of inquiry that the proof is out there represents, a test of humility, a challenge to arrogance, an invitation to curiosity without surrendering to credulity. And the first part closes not with a cliffhanger, but with a question that hangs in the air like fog at dusk. Not asking whether Caddy exists, but asking what it would mean if it did. How such a discovery would ripple through marine biology, through our understanding of extinction, through the quiet confidence with which we declare chapters of natural history closed. And this reframing is perhaps the most radical move of all, because it shifts the burden from the creature to us, suggesting that the true mystery is not hidden in the water, but in our willingness to look without demanding immediate answers. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left not with fear, but with a strange, almost childlike wonder, the sense that the world might still be larger than our explanations, deeper than our instruments, and alive in ways we have forgotten how to imagine. And in that moment, Caddy is no longer merely a subject of investigation, but a symbol of the unknown itself, patient, elusive, and waiting just beyond the edge of certainty. If Part 1 established Caddy as an idea shaped by water, memory, and disciplined doubt, then Part 2 descends beneath the surface to examine how images become belief, how a single frame frozen in time can destabilize decades of certainty. And the proof is out there leans heavily into this tension by foregrounding visual evidence not as revelation, but as provocation. Because images, the series insists, are never neutral. They are arguments disguised as witnesses, and the moment the episode introduces the most discussed photographs and videos associated with the Cadborosaurus, the narrative tone subtly shifts from atmospheric curiosity to forensic obsession, with analysts dissecting pixels the way detectives read blood spatter, aware that meaning hides not only in what is visible, but in what the eye is desperate to see. And the most iconic footage, shaky, distant, and frustratingly brief, becomes the gravitational center of this section, a moving shape slicing through water at an angle that defies the behavior of known animals. And yet the show resists the easy temptation to dramatize, instead slowing the footage down until it almost dissolves into abstraction, each frame interrogated for scale, lighting, refraction, and parallax, reminding the viewer that the ocean is a master illusionist, capable of stretching shadows, compressing distance, and bending reality into convincing lies. And it is precisely this awareness that makes the remaining anomalies so compelling. Because after accounting for waves, boats, floating debris, and even digital artifacts introduced by older recording equipment, something remains that refuses to align with expectation. And this remainder is never labeled a monster, but a question mark, an unresolved variable that science acknowledges even as it seeks to eliminate it. And what emerges here is a subtle critique of modern skepticism, not as a method, but as an attitude, the kind that assumes dismissal is synonymous with intelligence. And the proof is out there carefully distinguishes between healthy skepticism and intellectual laziness, suggesting that the former demands effort while the latter prefers conclusions. And in interviews with video analysts and marine imaging specialists, the episode reveals how much of our confidence in debunking rests on assumptions about frequency and familiarity, about how often something should appear to be considered real, and this logic, when applied to rare or reclusive species, begins to unravel, because rarity by definition resists documentation, and the ocean, vast and layered, is particularly adept at hiding what does not wish to be found, or perhaps simply does not wish to be disturbed. And the film deepens this argument by drawing parallels to historical discoveries once dismissed as impossible. Species that existed only in rumor until a body washed ashore or a net came up heavier than expected. And these stories are not used as proof that Caddy exists, but as reminders that disbelief has often been wrong before, that certainty ages poorly when confronted with new data. And here the episode introduces an emotional undercurrent that had been held at bay, the quiet frustration of witnesses whose credibility has been eroded not by contradiction, but by ridicule. Fishermen who stopped talking, coastal residents who learned to keep their stories private. And this silence becomes part of the mystery itself, because absence of testimony is often mistaken for absence of experience. And the show treats these human costs with a seriousness that elevates the narrative beyond entertainment, suggesting that the search for truth carries ethical weight, that how we listen matters as much as what we conclude. And as sonar imagery and underwater mapping are discussed, the technical limitations of our tools become glaringly apparent. Blind zones created by thermal layers, rocky seabeds that scatter signals, shallow passages where traditional deep sea methods fail, all combining to create pockets of invisibility where something large could pass unnoticed. And the idea that we have scanned every inch of the ocean floor is quietly dismantled, replaced with a more honest admission of partial knowledge. And in this context, Caddy becomes less extraordinary, less an intruder into a known system, and more a resident of an overlooked one. And the episode carefully avoids proposing a definitive biological classification, instead exploring hypotheses with cautious curiosity, elongated fish, unknown cetaceans, surviving marine reptiles, each option weighed and then set aside, not because it is wrong, but because it is insufficient. And this refusal to settle becomes the thematic backbone of Part 2, reinforcing the notion that mystery is not a failure of science, but a stage in its process. And the truncated title again looms large: Caddy the Cadborosaurus. The Loo. Its incompleteness mirroring the state of the evidence itself. And one of the most striking sequences involves a comparison between eyewitness sketches created decades apart, lined up side by side, revealing uncanny similarities in proportions and movement, similarities too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence, yet too imprecise to serve as proof. And this liminal space is where the series thrives, because it understands that the human mind is most engaged not by answers, but by patterns that almost resolve, and the editing reinforces this by intercutting scientific analysis with quiet shots of open water, the surface deceptively calm, the depths implied rather than shown. And by the time the segment reaches its closing movement, the viewer is no longer asking whether the footage is real, but what standards of reality we are willing to accept, whether absence of clarity equals absence of truth. And the episode challenges the binary thinking that dominates so much of modern discourse, proposing instead a spectrum of possibility where uncertainty is not weakness but honesty. And as the final image of Part 2 lingers on the waterline at twilight, the voiceover does not promise revelation but patience, suggesting that some truths do not reveal themselves under pressure, that some creatures, real or imagined, exist precisely because they remain unconfirmed. And in this way, Caddy becomes a mirror held up to our desire for certainty, reflecting back our discomfort with ambiguity, our hunger for closure, and our uneasy awareness that the world may still contain chapters we have not learned how to read. And as the screen fades, the question left behind is no longer about what was seen, but about how seeing itself is shaped by expectation, fear, and hope, and whether we are prepared to admit that not everything meaningful arrives with a label and a conclusion. Where Part 2 lingered on images and the fragile authority we grant to what can be recorded, Part 3 turns deliberately toward time, stretching the narrative backward and forward to show how the idea of Caddy survives not because of novelty, but because of endurance. And the proof is out there makes a quiet yet powerful decision here to treat history not as background, but as an active force. Something that presses forward into the present like a current that never truly stops flowing. And the episode begins to braid together accounts from different eras, not to romanticize them, but to test their resilience under comparison. Because if Cadborosaurus were merely a modern invention, a product of cameras and sensational media, its echoes would fade quickly once stripped of contemporary language. Yet what emerges instead is a chorus of voices separated by decades that somehow manage to describe the same melody. And this is where the story gains a deeper gravity, because consistency over time is harder to fabricate than spectacle in the moment. And as journals, ship logs, and early newspaper clippings are introduced, the language may change, but the core details remain stubbornly familiar. A long body moving with an undulating motion, humps rising and falling in sequence, a head lifted briefly above the water before slipping back into concealment. And the show is careful not to overstate this, allowing historians to contextualize how maritime reporting once functioned, how exaggeration was common, yet also constrained by reputational risk. Because a captain who lied in a logbook risked more than ridicule. He risked his livelihood, and this historical framing subtly recalibrates the viewer's instinctive skepticism, not dismantling it, but asking it to account for social realities that shaped testimony long before viral fame existed. And as the narrative progresses, the figure of Caddy becomes almost migratory in itself, appearing in clusters of sightings that correspond to seasonal patterns, currents, and ecological conditions. And this is where marine science begins to intersect with folklore in a way that feels unexpectedly harmonious. Because the show introduces oceanographers who speak about nutrient flows, salmon runs, and temperature shifts that could theoretically support a large, elusive predator without leaving obvious traces. And the implication is not that Cadborosaurus must exist, but that the environment it is said to inhabit is far more dynamic and complex than the simplified diagrams we learn in school. And this complexity creates space for survival strategies we may not fully understand: deep diving behavior, nocturnal surface activity, movement along underwater ridges that evade most observation, and the ocean once again asserts itself as an accomplice to mystery rather than a passive stage. And what makes this section particularly compelling is the way it addresses the accusation of hoaxing, a charge that often shuts down discussion before it can begin. And instead of dismissing the idea outright, the show examines it carefully, asking what motivation would persist across generations, across communities, without a central figure or clear benefit. And while hoaxes certainly exist, they tend to burn brightly and briefly, fueled by a tension that eventually exhausts itself, whereas the story of Caddy seems to smolder quietly, sustained by people who often gain nothing and sometimes lose credibility by speaking. And this inversion of incentive becomes a key point of analysis, suggesting that not all extraordinary claims are born of deception. Some are born of honest confusion, misidentification, or encounters that defy existing categories. And as anthropologists weigh in, the discussion widens to consider how coastal cultures integrate unexplained phenomena into their identity, not as threats, but as companions to daily life. Stories told not to frighten, but to orient, to remind people that they live at the edge of something larger than themselves. And this cultural dimension adds emotional depth to Caddy's persistence, because it frames the creature not as an intrusion in a human order, but as part of a shared landscape, something woven into the rhythm of tides and seasons. And the show does not shy away from addressing how modern media has reshaped these narratives, sometimes amplifying them, sometimes distorting them, creating feedback loops where expectation influences perception. And here, the episode becomes almost self-critical, acknowledging that the proof is out there itself participates in this ecosystem of belief and doubt. And by doing so, it earns a measure of trust, because it refuses to pretend neutrality while clearly striving for fairness. And the editing reflects this maturity, slowing the pace, allowing interviews to breathe, lingering on faces as people search for words that balance conviction with uncertainty. And one particularly resonant moment involves an elderly witness who admits openly that they do not know what they saw, only that it was not what they expected. And this humility becomes one of the most persuasive elements of the entire narrative, because certainty is easy to doubt, but honest confusion is harder to dismiss. And as the episode shifts toward modern scientific expeditions, the tension between funding, reputation, and curiosity comes into sharp focus. with researchers explaining how pursuing unverified creatures can jeopardize careers, creating a quiet censorship that shapes what questions are allowed to be asked. And this revelation reframes the absence of definitive studies not as proof of non-existence, but as a consequence of institutional caution. And the idea that science is purely objective begins to erode, replaced by a more realistic portrait of a human endeavor constrained by resources, politics, and fear of embarrassment. And in this light, the mystery of Caddy feels less like an anomaly and more like a casualty of risk management, something left unexplored because it does not fit neatly into grant proposals or peer-reviewed journals. And yet the episode resists turning this into an indictment, instead presenting it as a dilemma without villains, a system that rewards certainty over curiosity. And as sonar scans and exploratory dives are discussed, the limitations of each method are again emphasized, reinforcing the theme that tools shape outcomes, that what we find is often dictated by what we look for. And if we are not looking for something like Cadborosaurus, we are unlikely to recognize it even if it passes directly beneath us. And this epistemological blind spot becomes one of the most profound ideas introduced so far, suggesting that knowledge is not only about discovery, but about recognition, about having the conceptual space to say this does not fit. And the truncated title continues to echo its unfinished nature, now feeling less like a tease and more like a philosophical statement, because the story itself refuses completion. And as Part 3 draws toward its conclusion, the narrative does not crescendo, but settles, like sediment falling through water, leaving the viewer with a layered understanding rather than a single takeaway. And the final reflections return to the sea at night, dark, reflective, inscrutable, while the voiceover speaks not of proof but of persistence, of why certain mysteries endure despite our efforts to resolve them. And the suggestion offered is both simple and unsettling, that some questions survive because they are true enough to matter but elusive enough to resist closure. And Caddy, whether creature or construct, occupies this space perfectly, a reminder that the unknown does not need our permission to exist, and that perhaps the most honest position is not belief or disbelief, but attentive waiting, the willingness to listen to the water, to history, and to each other without demanding that everything resolve into certainty. And in that sense, Part 3 does not advance the case for Cadborosaurus so much as it deepens the case for humility, leaving us suspended between skepticism and wonder, aware that the line between them is thinner than we like to admit. Part 4 shifts the lens from collective memory and institutional hesitation to the intimate psychology of encounter, because the proof is out there understands that the most fragile and revealing evidence in any mystery is not the image or the instrument, but the human mind at the moment it confronts something it cannot immediately categorize. And this section unfolds almost like a slow study of perception under pressure, examining how witnesses describe Caddy not only in terms of shape and movement, but in terms of feeling a tightening in the chest, a sudden alertness, a sense of being observed rather than merely observing. And the episode is careful here to avoid mysticism, grounding these sensations in neuroscience and cognitive science, bringing in experts who explain how the brain reacts when confronted with anomalies, how pattern recognition accelerates, how fear and awe activate overlapping neural pathways, and how memory encoding becomes unusually vivid, yet paradoxically unstable. And this scientific framing does not undermine the witnesses, but humanizes them, showing that their certainty and uncertainty can coexist without contradiction. And one of the most compelling aspects of this part is the way it dissects the moment of first sighting, the split second when the mind scrambles to match what it sees with existing categories. Because if Caddy were immediately identifiable as a known animal, the mystery would collapse. But what these accounts consistently reveal is a delay, a hesitation, a brief mental vacuum where recognition fails. And it is in this vacuum that the experience becomes unforgettable, because the brain marks it as unresolved, tagging it for repeated recall. And the show treats this process with respect, resisting the common dismissal that such experiences are simply imagination filling gaps. instead suggesting that imagination is often the last resort when perception exceeds classification. And as psychologists discuss phenomena like schema violation and cognitive dissonance, the narrative subtly reframes eyewitness testimony not as unreliable by default, but as data that must be interpreted within the context of human cognition rather than stripped of it. And this is a crucial move because it challenges the simplistic hierarchy that places instruments above people, reminding us that instruments are designed by people and limited by their assumptions, while perception, though flawed, is adaptive and nuanced. And the episode deepens this exploration by contrasting accounts from trained observers and laypeople, sailors, biologists, coast guards, tourists, noting both differences and overlaps. And what emerges is not a neat pattern, but a textured one. Variations in language and emphasis overlaying a shared core of experience. And this layered consistency becomes psychologically significant, because independent descriptions, converging on similar elements, suggest not contagion of belief, but convergence of perception. And yet the show remains disciplined, acknowledging how suggestion, media exposure, and cultural narratives can shape memory over time. And here it becomes self-aware again, interrogating how the very act of watching the proof is out there might influence future sightings. And this reflexivity adds credibility, because it shows a willingness to examine its own impact rather than pretending to exist outside the systemic critiques. And as the narrative moves deeper into individual stories, it introduces moments of vulnerability rarely seen in investigative television. Witnesses admitting fear of ridicule, of being labeled irrational, of having their professional competence questioned. And this fear becomes a recurring theme, a silent current running beneath the surface of the mystery, shaping who speaks and who stays silent. And the show suggests that this social pressure may be one of the most effective concealment mechanisms of all, because it discourages reporting not through force, but through shame. And in this context, the absence of overwhelming evidence begins to look less like a void and more like a product of cultural filtering. And the episode does not argue that this proves the existence of Cadborosaurus, but it does argue that it complicates the assumption that truth naturally rises to the surface, especially when that truth threatens established frameworks. And this idea is reinforced through historical parallels to sightings of once mythical animals that were later confirmed, not as proof, but as cautionary tales about premature dismissal. And the discussion of perception extends into the realm of motion analysis, examining why the way Caddy is said to move matters as much as how it looks. Because movement patterns are harder to fabricate unconsciously, and several experts note that the undulating, segmented motion described does not align neatly with common marine mammals. And while this observation stops short of proposing an unknown species, it adds another layer to the anomaly, one that resists easy categorization. And the show cleverly juxtaposes these analyses with slow-motion footage of known animals moving through similar waters, seals, porpoises, whales, highlighting both similarities and differences, and inviting the viewer to engage in comparative observation rather than passive acceptance. And this participatory approach is one of the series' greatest strengths, because it treats the audience not as consumers of conclusions, but as collaborators in inquiry. And as the episode unfolds, the emotional stakes quietly intensify, not through drama, but through accumulation, each testimony adding weight, each analysis adding nuance, until the question of Caddy's existence begins to feel almost secondary to the question of how we process the unknown. And this shift is deliberate. Because the proof is out, there is less interested in delivering answers than in examining the machinery of belief and doubt. And Part 4 crystallizes this mission by focusing on the human cost of unresolved experience, the lingering unease of not knowing, the way an encounter can echo through a life, reshaping one's relationship with the world. And one particularly striking account describes how, after seeing something unidentifiable, the witness began to notice how much of the natural world operates beyond human awareness. How many sounds and movements go unnoticed until attention is sharpened by anomaly. And this expanded awareness becomes almost a gift, a widening of perception rather than a narrowing into fear. And the show treats this transformation with sensitivity, suggesting that encounters with mystery can be generative rather than traumatic, fostering curiosity and humility. And this reframing challenges the sensationalist trope that unknown creatures exist primarily to terrify, instead proposing that they can also inspire attentiveness. And as the episode approaches its conclusion, it revisits the idea of proof itself, questioning whether proof is always a single decisive moment or whether it can be cumulative, experiential, relational. And this philosophical turn does not abandon scientific rigor, but enriches it, acknowledging that different kinds of questions require different standards of answer. And the truncated title again resonates, Caddy the Cadborosaurus, the Loo, now feeling like an invitation to listen, to linger, to live with uncertainty rather than rushing to resolve it. And the final scenes return to the water at dawn, light gradually revealing the surface without exposing the depths, a visual metaphor for partial knowledge. And the voiceover speaks of attention as a form of respect, of looking carefully without insisting on ownership of what is seen. And this quiet ending reinforces the idea that the true subject of Part 4 is not a creature, but a relationship between humans and the unknown, between certainty and wonder, between fear and curiosity. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left with a sense that Caddy, whether real or symbolic, functions as a catalyst, drawing out our deepest assumptions about reality and challenging us to examine how we respond when those assumptions are gently but persistently disturbed. And in this way, the mystery becomes less about solving a puzzle and more about cultivating a posture of openness, a willingness to say, I do not know, without feeling diminished by the admission. And that may be the most unsettling and liberating proof of all. Part 5 widens the frame once more, pulling back from individual perception to examine the broader ecosystem of evidence, motivation, and meaning, because the proof is out there understands that mysteries like Caddy do not exist in isolation, but within networks of economics, media, science, and human longing. And this section explores how those networks shape not only what is seen, but what is pursued, funded, amplified, or quietly ignored. And the episode opens by addressing a question that hovers over every cryptid investigation like an unspoken accusation. Who benefits if Caddy exists? And just as importantly, who benefits if it does not? And this inversion is crucial because it destabilizes the simplistic narrative that belief is always driven by profit or attention, while skepticism is always pure, and instead reveals a more complicated terrain where incentives pull in multiple directions at once. And as the show examines tourism campaigns, local folklore merchandise, and media cycles, it does so without cynicism, acknowledging that stories can generate economic activity without being deliberately fabricated, because communities often lean into legends not because they invented them, but because they inherited them. And the line between cultural celebration and exploitation becomes blurred, and this ambiguity mirrors the larger mystery itself, resistant to clean moral divisions. And at the same time, the episode turns its gaze towards scientific institutions, funding bodies, and academic publishing, illuminating how research priorities are shaped less by curiosity than by predictability. Because grants favor questions with high likelihood of success, peer review favors conclusions that fit within existing paradigms. And young researchers are often advised, implicitly or explicitly, to avoid topics that could brand them as unserious. And in this environment, the investigation of an unverified marine animal becomes professionally risky, regardless of its potential importance. And this does not require conspiracy to function. Only inertia, the slow, grinding force of norms that discourage deviation. And the proof is out there treats this not as corruption, but as a structural bias, a system optimized for incremental knowledge rather than disruptive discovery. And this perspective adds depth to the absence of definitive studies on Cadborosaurus, reframing it as a product of caution rather than evidence of impossibility in the episode. reinforces this by drawing parallels to other fields where anomalies were sidelined until technology or social attitudes shifted, moments when the unknown was tolerated long enough to become known. And these parallels are offered not as promises, but as reminders that the boundary of science is not fixed. It moves, often slowly, often reluctantly, and always unevenly. And this realization casts Caddy in a new light, not as an outlier demanding immediate validation, but as a stress test for our systems of knowledge, revealing where they are flexible and where they are brittle. And as the narrative progresses, the role of media comes under scrutiny, including the series itself. And here Part 5 becomes particularly self-reflective, examining how storytelling techniques influence belief, how music, pacing, and framing can tilt perception even when facts remain unchanged, and rather than denying this influence, the show acknowledges it openly, inviting viewers to consider how their emotional responses are being shaped, and this transparency strengthens rather than weakens the investigation, because it models critical engagement rather than passive consumption. And one of the most striking discussions centers on the concept of narrative hunger, the human tendency to seek coherence, resolution, and meaning, especially in ambiguous situations. And psychologists explain how this hunger can drive both belief and disbelief, pushing some people to accept extraordinary explanations while pushing others to reject anything that threatens closure. And in this way, certainty and denial are revealed as siblings rather than opposites, both offering relief from the discomfort of not knowing. And Caddy persists precisely because it refuses to satisfy either impulse fully, remaining too plausible to dismiss outright and too elusive to confirm decisively. And this tension is what keeps the story alive, circulating through generations, adapting to new technologies and sensibilities without losing its core shape. And the episode illustrates this adaptability by tracing how descriptions of Caddy have subtly evolved, not in substance, but in language, from nautical metaphors rooted in sailing culture to modern comparisons drawn from documentaries and digital imagery. And this evolution underscores how observation is filtered through available vocabulary, a reminder that what we see is inseparable from how we describe it. And yet beneath these shifting metaphors, the same fundamental elements persist: movement, size, presence. And this persistence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, and the show does not claim that this equals proof, but it does claim that it deserves sustained attention rather than reflexive dismissal. And as the discussion turns toward future possibilities, the episode explores emerging technologies that could change the investigation landscape. Autonomous underwater vehicles, environmental DNA sampling, machine learning, analysis of sonar data, tools that could detect traces of large organisms without requiring direct observation. And these developments are presented with cautious optimism, not as imminent solutions, but as signs that the unknown is not static, that the questions we cannot answer today may become approachable tomorrow. And this forward-looking perspective prevents the narrative from stagnating in nostalgia or frustration, instead positioning Caddy as part of an ongoing dialogue between mystery and method. And the emotional tone of Part 5 reflects this balance, less wonderstruck than earlier sections, but more contemplative, as if the series itself is pausing to take stock of what has been assembled so far. And what emerges is a recognition that the significance of Caddy lies not solely in its potential existence, but in what it reveals about our priorities, our fears, and our willingness to allocate attention. In one particularly resonant moment involves a discussion of extinction. How many species vanish without ever being documented? How absence of proof can mask loss as easily as it masks survival? And this inversion reframes the stakes of the investigation, suggesting that the question is not only could Caddy exist, but what does our uncertainty say about the countless forms of life that pass beneath our notice? And this ecological perspective broadens the narrative beyond a single creature, situating it within a larger conversation about humility in the face of biodiversity. And the ocean once again emerges as both subject and symbol, vast, layered, resistant to simplification. And as the episode approaches its conclusion, it returns to the truncated title, now feeling less like an unfinished thought and more like an ethical stance, a refusal to overdefine, to claim ownership over something that may not wish to be claimed. And the voiceover speaks quietly about patience, about allowing questions to remain open without losing rigor. And this balance becomes the moral center of Part 5, a reminder that skepticism and curiosity are not enemies but partners, and that the most honest investigations are those that resist the pressure to conclude prematurely, and the final images linger on the interplay between surface and depth, sunlight fracturing into patterns that hint at movement below without revealing its source. And this visual metaphor encapsulates the episode's core insight, that knowledge often arrives indirectly through reflection and distortion, requiring interpretation rather than certainty. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left with a sense that the story of Caddy is not approaching an end, but entering a new phase, one defined less by the demand for proof and more by the cultivation of better questions. And in this way, Part 5 serves as a hinge in the larger narrative, transitioning from examination of what has been seen and said to contemplation of what might still be possible, and reminding us that the unknown is not a failure of understanding, but a frontier shaped by choices, values, and the courage to look without guarantees. Part 6 marks a subtle but decisive turn in the narrative, shifting from systems and structures back toward the raw interface between humans and environment. Because after examining how institutions, media, and incentives frame the mystery of Caddy, the proof is out there now asks a more elemental question. What actually happens when people go looking, not with cameras already rolling for television, but with quiet intent, patience, and a willingness to accept ambiguity as part of the process? And this section unfolds almost like a field journal expanded into cinematic form, tracing expeditions both formal and informal, moments when curiosity overcame caution and individuals ventured into the inlets, channels, and fog-heavy passages where sightings cluster. And what becomes immediately apparent is how profoundly different the sea feels when approached as a collaborator rather than an object of conquest. Because the episode emphasizes waiting over chasing, listening over scanning, and in doing so, it captures something rarely conveyed in investigative media: the texture of time itself. Hours of nothing punctuated by seconds of heightened attention, and this rhythm mirrors the lived experience of those who spend their lives on the water, reinforcing the idea that understanding emerges not from constant stimulation but from attunement, and as marine researchers and seasoned sailors describe their methods. The show highlights a form of knowledge that exists alongside formal science, experiential, embodied, learned through repetition and failure. And this knowledge does not speak in absolutes, but in probabilities, subtle shifts in current, unusual patterns of bird behavior, inexplicable disturbances that do not register as alarms, but as questions. And it is within these questions that Caddy is said to appear fleetingly, ambiguously, as if testing whether it is being watched with the right kind of attention, and the episode is careful not to romanticize this, acknowledging the frustration and doubt that accompany long stretches of nothing, the temptation to project meaning onto randomness, and the discipline required to resist that impulse. And this discipline becomes a recurring theme because it distinguishes serious inquiry from obsession, patience from fixation, and the narrative treats this distinction as ethically significant, suggesting that how we search matters as much as what we find. And as the show documents modern expeditions equipped with advanced technology, the contrast between expectation and reality becomes stark. Drones grounded by weather, sonar readings cluttered with noise, instruments failing in the very conditions where sightings are most likely to occur. And these failures are not portrayed as setbacks, but as reminders of scale, of how small human effort remains against the complexity of marine environments. And this humility infuses the tone of Part 6, tempering curiosity with respect. And one of the most compelling sequences involves environmental DNA sampling, a technique capable of detecting traces of organisms through genetic material suspended in water. And while the results discussed are inconclusive, The process itself becomes emblematic of a new approach to mystery, one that does not require spectacle or capture, only presence and sensitivity. And the episode treats this as a philosophical evolution as much as a technological one, a move away from domination toward detection, from proof, as possession toward proof as trace. And this shift resonates deeply with the ethos of the proof is out there, reinforcing the idea that certainty may arrive indirectly, pieced together from fragments rather than delivered whole. And as the narrative weaves together account from these expeditions, a pattern emerges not of dramatic encounters, but of near misses, moments when something almost aligns. A sonar blip that does not repeat, a wake that forms without an obvious source, a shape glimpsed, at the edge of visibility and then gone. And these moments are treated with restraint, neither inflated nor dismissed, allowed to exist as data points without forcing them into a narrative of confirmation. And this restraint is perhaps the most persuasive element of the entire series, because it signals confidence in the audience's ability to tolerate uncertainty. And the episode deepens this trust by exploring the emotional landscape of those who search, the oscillation between hope and skepticism, the quiet joy of being present in a place where mystery is possible, and the disappointment of returning empty-handed. And this emotional honesty prevents the investigation from becoming abstract, grounding it in lived experience rather than theoretical debate. And as the show reflects on why people continue to search despite repeated ambiguity, the answer offered is not obsession or belief, but relationship, a sense of connection to a place and its stories. And in this framing, Caddy becomes less a target than a focal point, a way of orienting attention toward the sea itself. And this reframing has profound implications, because it suggests that the value of the investigation does not hinge on a definitive discovery, but on the knowledge gained along the way about ecosystems, about perception, about the limits of certainty. And the episode reinforces this by highlighting incidental findings from these searches, data collected on currents, species distributions, and environmental changes that contribute to broader scientific understanding regardless of whether Cadborosaurus is ever confirmed. And this pragmatic optimism balances the wonder that permeates earlier parts, grounding it in tangible outcomes. And as Part 6 approaches its conclusion, the narrative slows even further, lingering on images of water at different depths and times of day, the surface reflecting sky, the depths absorbing light, and the voiceover speaks quietly about patience as a form of respect, about the difference between seeking answers and demanding them. And this distinction becomes the moral through line of the episode because it encapsulates the series' approach to mystery, rigorous yet gentle, skeptical yet open, and the truncated title once again feels apt. Caddy the Cadborosaurus, the Lou, now echoing like a half-remembered phrase, something that invites completion but does not require it. And the final moments return to the idea of waiting, of listening, of accepting that some phenomena reveal themselves only on their own terms, if at all. And this acceptance does not diminish the search but dignifies it, transforming inquiry from a quest for conquest into a practice of attention. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left with a sense that the story has reached a deeper layer, one where the question of existence intertwines with questions of method, ethics, and humility, and where the unknown is not an adversary to be defeated, but a partner in an ongoing conversation, patient, silent, and perhaps aware of how intently it is being watched. Part 7 moves into the most controversial and intellectually charged territory yet, because after patience, perception, and fieldwork, the proof is out there turns toward the question that quietly governs all the others. What would it actually mean for science, culture, and self-understanding if Caddy were real? And this part does not ask that question hypothetically but analytically, tracing the shockwaves such a confirmation would send through established frameworks, beginning with taxonomy. In evolutionary theory, where the existence of a large, previously undocumented marine vertebrate in heavily trafficked coastal waters would force a re-examination of assumptions about extinction, ecological monitoring, and the completeness of the fossil record. And the episode approaches this carefully, bringing in evolutionary biologists who explain how survival of a relict population would not contradict evolution, but complicate its narrative, because extinction is rarely absolute, often messy, uneven, and regionally delayed, and the idea that a lineage could persist in ecological refuges long after its apparent disappearance is not unprecedented, merely uncomfortable. And this discomfort becomes a central theme, because it reveals how much of modern science depends on closure, on drawing lines that say this chapter is finished, and Caddy threatens that closure not with spectacle, but with persistence. And the show deepens this argument by examining how scientific revolutions rarely arrive cleanly, how they are resisted not because evidence is weak, but because implications are strong. And this historical perspective reframes skepticism as a social process rather than a purely rational one, shaped by reputational risk, institutional momentum, and the fear of being wrong in public. And the proof is out there treats this fear with empathy rather than accusation, acknowledging that caution is often the price of credibility, yet also suggesting that excessive caution can calcify into blindness. And this tension becomes especially vivid when the episode explores how confirmation of Cadborosaurus would ripple outward beyond biology into policy, conservation, and law, because the presence of an undocumented large species could trigger protections, restrictions on shipping, fishing, and development. And this introduces a layer of resistance rarely acknowledged in cryptid discussions. The possibility that non-discovery is sometimes more convenient than discovery. Not because of conspiracy, but because of consequence. And the show handles this delicately, making clear that no one needs to suppress evidence for these dynamics to operate, because systems naturally favor outcomes that preserve stability, and uncertainty, paradoxically, can be easier to live within confirmation. And this insight reframes the long endurance of the Caddy mystery not as a failure of detection, but as a byproduct of complexity. And as the narrative continues, it turns toward the cultural ramifications, exploring how confirmation would alter the meaning of Caddy itself, transforming it from a symbol of the unknown into an object of management, study, and possibly exploitation. And this raises an uncomfortable question: whether mystery loses something when it becomes fact. And anthropologists discuss how legends often serve functions that raw data cannot, providing shared narratives that connect people to place and history. And the episode suggests that in some ways, Caddy's power lies precisely in its unresolved status, acting as a reminder that not everything is accounted for. And this does not mean that truth should be avoided, but it does mean that truth carries costs as well as benefits. And this balanced perspective prevents the episode from slipping into either romantic mysticism or anti-scientific sentiment, instead occupying a thoughtful middle ground where curiosity and caution coexist. And the show reinforces this by examining cases where discovery led to harm, species driven to extinction after being found, ecosystems disrupted by attention. And this ecological cautionary thread adds moral weight to the investigation, suggesting that the desire to know must be paired with the responsibility to protect. And in this context, the question of proof becomes ethical as well as empirical, because proof is not neutral. It changes behavior, priorities, and power dynamics. And the proof is out there uses this insight to challenge the simplistic demand for definitive answers, asking viewers to consider whether the timing and manner of discovery matter as much as discovery itself. And this leads into a fascinating discussion of alternative forms of validation. Not full confirmation, but increasing resolution, probability rather than certainty. And statisticians and philosophers of science explain how many accepted scientific truths exist not as absolutes, but as best explanations given available data. And this reframing undermines the binary logic that dominates public discourse, the idea that something must be either fully proven or fully false. And in this more nuanced landscape, Caddy can exist as a serious hypothesis without requiring immediate confirmation. And this intellectual shift may be one of the most important contributions of the series, because it models a way of thinking that is both rigorous and flexible. And as the episode continues, it returns to the human dimension, exploring how individuals would react if Caddy were confirmed, from vindication felt by witnesses to disorientation felt by skeptics, and psychologists discuss how belief revision can be emotionally taxing, threatening identity and worldview. And this empathy for all positions further deepens the narrative, refusing to caricature either side. And the show also considers the inverse scenario. What if Caddy is conclusively disproven? And here, too, the implications are complex, because disproof would not erase decades of experience, memory, and meaning. And the episode suggests that even definitive negative results would leave behind residue. Questions about misperception, about shared narratives, about why this particular idea took root and endured, and in this sense the mystery would persist in another form, transformed rather than eliminated. And this insight reinforces the series' central argument that mysteries are processes rather than problems, evolving as knowledge evolves, and the truncated title continues to resonate, now feeling almost prophetic, because any attempt to complete it feels premature, as if the story itself resists final punctuation, and as Part 7 moves toward its conclusion, the narrative tone becomes reflective, almost philosophical, with the voiceover speaking about humility not as weakness, but as strength, the courage to hold questions open without forcing them closed. And this theme is underscored by imagery of the coastline changing with weather and light. Never the same twice, always recognizable, yet always new, a visual metaphor for knowledge itself. And the episode closes not with an argument, but with an invitation, asking viewers to imagine a form of understanding that does not demand mastery, a relationship with the unknown grounded in respect rather than conquest. And in this framing, Caddy becomes less a test of belief than a mirror held up to our methods, our expectations, and our patience, and whether or not the creature exists in a biological sense. Its impact is undeniably real, shaping inquiry, conversation, and attention. And this realization brings Part 7 to a quiet, resonant pause, not an ending, but a moment of suspension, as if the narrative itself is waiting, listening for what might emerge next from the depths. And in that waiting, the viewer is asked not to choose a side, but to cultivate a stance, open, critical, and aware that some truths arrive not as answers, but as deeper questions that change how we look at the world. Part 8 turns inward, almost imperceptibly at first, shifting the focus from what Caddy would mean for science and society to what the mystery already does to the people who live alongside it, because the proof is out there recognizes that long before confirmation or refutation, unresolved phenomena exert a quiet psychological gravity, shaping routines, identities, and relationships in ways that rarely make headlines. And this section unfolds like a study of coexistence, examining how communities adapt to the presence of an unanswered question without allowing it to dominate their lives. And the episode opens along familiar shorelines, docks creaking underfoot, boats rocking gently, voices low and unhurried. And what becomes clear almost immediately is that for many locals, Caddy is not an obsession but a background presence, something acknowledged without urgency, like weather patterns or seasonal tides. And this normalization of mystery becomes a central insight of Part 8, because it challenges the assumption that the unknown must always provoke anxiety or urgency, suggesting instead that humans are capable of living with ambiguity in surprisingly stable ways. And anthropologists and sociologists are brought in to discuss how communities integrate uncertainty into shared narratives, not as a problem to be solved, but as a feature of place, a marker of distinctiveness that binds people together through shared reference rather than shared belief. And in this framing, Caddy becomes less a question of fact and more a point of orientation, a story that signals belonging, that distinguishes insiders from outsiders, those who understand the water from those who merely visit it. And the episode is careful to avoid romanticizing this dynamic, acknowledging that it can foster both connection and exclusion, curiosity and defensiveness. And yet it treats these tensions as organic rather than pathological, natural outcomes of humans negotiating meaning together. And as the narrative deepens, It explores how individual lives intersect with the mystery over time, how a single sighting or story can echo through decades, resurfacing unexpectedly, influencing career choices, hobbies, and even parenting. And these personal arcs are presented with restraint, allowing viewers to see how mystery can function as a quiet companion rather than a disruptive force. And one particularly resonant account describes how curiosity about Caddy led someone into marine conservation, not because they believed unquestioningly, but because the idea of something unknown surviving in fragile ecosystems sharpened their sense of responsibility toward the environment as a whole. And this unintended consequence becomes a powerful argument for the generative potential of mystery, because it shows how unanswered questions can motivate care rather than exploitation. And the show reinforces this theme by examining how the legend of Caddy has influenced environmental awareness in subtle ways, encouraging respect for habitats that might otherwise be dismissed as ordinary or expendable. And this ecological ripple effect reframes the value of the mystery, suggesting that its worth may lie not in resolution, but in the behaviors it inspires. And as psychologists discuss the concept of tolerated uncertainty, the ability to hold open questions without distress. The episode positions this skill as increasingly rare and increasingly valuable in a culture driven by immediacy and certainty, and Caddy becomes a case study in this lost art, an example of how ambiguity can be integrated into daily life without eroding stability. And this insight lends Part 8 a quietly subversive quality, because it challenges the dominant narrative that not knowing is inherently negative, and instead proposes that some forms of not knowing are healthy, even protective, fostering humility and adaptability. And the episode juxtaposes this with modern digital culture, where speculation accelerates, opinions harden quickly, and mysteries are pressured into premature resolution. And here the show examines how online discourse has reshaped the Caddy narrative, amplifying extremes, belief, and debunking alike, while often erasing the nuanced middle ground where most lived experience resides. And this contrast highlights the difference between lived mystery and mediated mystery, between stories told slowly over time and narratives consumed rapidly for entertainment. And the proof is out there positions itself carefully between these modes, acknowledging its role in amplification while striving to preserve complexity. And this self-awareness becomes more pronounced as the episode explores the ethics of representation, how editing choices, framing, and emphasis can either honor or distort the experiences of those involved. And by making these choices visible, the series invites viewers to become more critical participants, aware of how narratives are constructed. And as the episode continues, it returns repeatedly to the water itself, treating it not merely as a setting, but as an active presence that shapes human behavior, schedules, and expectations. And marine ecologists explain how living near the ocean requires constant adjustment, attentiveness to conditions that cannot be controlled. And this lived dependence on unpredictability may help explain why coastal cultures often tolerate mystery more readily than inland ones, because uncertainty is already woven into daily survival. And in this context, Caddy feels less disruptive, more like an extension of an existing relationship with an environment that resists mastery. And the episode deepens this idea by examining language, the casual way locals speak about unusual sightings without drama, using understatement and humor rather than alarm. And this linguistic texture becomes evidence in its own right, suggesting familiarity rather than fabrication, comfort rather than fear. And the show allows these moments to stand without interpretation, trusting the viewer to sense their significance. And as Part 8 approaches its conclusion, it reflects on how mysteries change across generations, how younger residents inherit stories stripped of urgency but rich in atmosphere, and how this inheritance shapes imagination and identity. And educators discuss how such stories can foster curiosity and respect for the natural world when presented responsibly, not as facts but as open questions. And this pedagogical angle adds another layer to the significance of Caddy, positioning it as a tool for learning how to ask questions rather than how to answer them. And the truncated title once again echoes, now feeling almost gentle, an unfinished sentence passed down rather than a puzzle demanding completion. And the voiceover speaks about coexistence, about living alongside what we do not fully understand without either denying it or surrendering to it. And this balance becomes the emotional core of Part 8, a reminder that human resilience is not measured solely by problem solving, but by adaptability, by the capacity to incorporate uncertainty into meaning without letting it erode trust or curiosity. And the final images linger on everyday life along the coast. Children playing, boats returning, conversations unfolding against the backdrop of water that holds its secrets without malice. And this ordinariness becomes the episode's quiet revelation, because it shows that the presence of mystery does not necessarily destabilize life. It can simply accompany it, enriching perception without demanding resolution. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left with a sense that Caddy, whatever it ultimately proves to be, already exists in a social and psychological sense, woven into routines, values, and ways of seeing, and that this existence, subtle and enduring, may be as significant as any biological confirmation could ever be, because it reveals something essential about how humans live with the unknown, not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a companion that deepens attention, patience, and respect for a world that remains, despite all our tools and theories, profoundly unfinished. Part 9 pivots the narrative once again, this time toward comparison, because after dwelling in community, psychology, and coexistence, the proof is out there asks what happens when Caddy is placed alongside other mysteries, not to dilute its uniqueness, but to sharpen it. And this comparative lens becomes a powerful analytical tool, revealing patterns that are invisible when each case is treated in isolation. And the episode opens by situating Cadborosaurus within the broader history of unexplained marine phenomena, sea serpents, giant squids before they were confirmed, anomalous sonar contacts, creatures that once existed only in sailors' tales until technology caught up with testimony. And the show is careful here to avoid the lazy equivalence that assumes similarity equals validity, instead dissecting each comparison to identify where parallels hold and where they break down. And this methodological rigor elevates the discussion, transforming what could have been sensational montage into a disciplined inquiry into how mysteries behave over time. And what quickly becomes apparent is that enduring mysteries share certain structural features. They persist across generations. They resist definitive capture. They cluster geographically, and they generate a spectrum of responses rather than consensus. And Caddy fits this pattern with uncanny precision, which does not prove its existence, but does suggest that it occupies the same epistemic category as phenomena later resolved through incremental discovery rather than dramatic revelation. And this insight reframes patience as a rational strategy rather than an emotional one. And as the episode explores famous cases from different cultures and eras, it highlights how explanations often arrived not by overturning testimony, but by contextualizing it, understanding the environmental and technological constraints that shape perception. And this historical perspective undermines the assumption that early observers were naive or dishonest, showing instead that they worked within the limits of their tools and language, much as we do now. And the implication is subtle but profound, that future generations may look back on our certainty with similar skepticism. And this temporal humility becomes a recurring motif, reminding viewers that knowledge is provisional, always embedded in a moment. And the show reinforces this by examining how debunkings themselves evolve, how explanations once considered definitive are later revised or abandoned as new data emerges. And this dynamism challenges the notion that skepticism represents an endpoint, suggesting instead that it too is a process subject to revision. And within this framework, Caddy becomes less an anomaly and more a participant in an ongoing cycle of question, explanation, and reconsideration. And the episode deepens this analysis by contrasting Caddy with cases that collapsed quickly under scrutiny, hoaxes that unravel due to internal inconsistencies, financial incentives, or centralized authorship, and the absence of these markers in the Cadborosaurus narrative becomes increasingly conspicuous, not as proof, but as a distinguishing feature, and the show is careful to phrase this as a pattern rather than a verdict, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions. And as marine biologists discuss how ecosystems can support large organisms with minimal surface presence, the episode connects these ideas to confirmed species that were once thought implausible due to similar reasoning errors, assumptions about population size, detection probability, and habitat use. And this technical discussion grounds the comparisons in science rather than speculation, reinforcing the series' commitment to rigor. And the narrative then turns toward inland parallels, unexplained phenomena in forests, skies, and remote landscapes. Not to suggest equivalence, but to examine how different environments shape different kinds of mystery. And here the ocean emerges once again as uniquely suited to concealment, its opacity, depth, and constant motion creating conditions where absence of evidence is particularly ambiguous. And this environmental specificity strengthens the case that marine mysteries require different standards of evaluation than terrestrial ones, and Caddy benefits from this contextualization, appearing less implausible when judged by appropriate criteria. And as the episode progresses, it introduces philosophers of science who discuss the concept of anomaly, how unresolved data points function within scientific frameworks not as threats, but as prompts for refinement. And this theoretical lens casts Caddy as a productive anomaly, one that exposes gaps in monitoring, taxonomy, and public understanding, regardless of its ultimate resolution. And this reframing shifts the value of the mystery from outcome to process, emphasizing what is learned along the way. And the episode illustrates this by highlighting how investigations into Cadborosaurus have driven advances in local ecological knowledge, improved reporting standards, and fostered collaboration between amateurs and professionals. And these concrete benefits challenge the dismissive view that cryptid investigations are inherently frivolous, showing instead that when conducted responsibly, they can function as gateways to broader scientific engagement. And the show underscores this by revisiting earlier expeditions and testimonies, now seen through the comparative lens, revealing new layers of significance that were not apparent before. And this recursive structure reinforces the idea that understanding deepens through iteration rather than accumulation. And as Part 9 approaches its latter half, the narrative becomes more introspective, asking why certain mysteries endure while others fade. And sociologists discuss how stories that resonate with fundamental human themes, survival, persistence, the unknown, just beyond reach, are more likely to be preserved. And Caddy's narrative aligns perfectly with these themes, positioned at the edge of land and sea, past and present, known and unknown. And this symbolic potency may contribute as much to its endurance as any empirical factor. And the show treats this not as a dismissal, but as an insight, acknowledging that meaning and evidence are intertwined in complex ways. And as the episode draws toward its conclusion, it returns to the question of convergence, not of belief, but of attention, noting how disparate lines of inquiry, historical records, eyewitness accounts, environmental analysis, and comparative studies all converge on the same geographic and conceptual focal point. And this convergence does not resolve the mystery, but sharpens it, making it harder to ignore without overstating its certainty. And the truncated title once again feels deliberate, an open clause that resists completion, mirroring the state of the investigation itself. And the voiceover speaks quietly about perspective, about the difference between zooming in and stepping back, and how both are necessary for understanding. And this balance becomes the guiding principle of Part 9, encouraging viewers to hold multiple frames at once: skepticism and openness, comparison and specificity. And the final images juxtapose archival illustrations of sea serpents with modern sonar screens, old maps with satellite imagery, emphasizing continuity rather than rupture. And this visual rhyme reinforces the episode's central insight, that mystery evolves with us, reshaped by our tools and language, but never entirely dissolved. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left with a sense that Caddy's story is not an outlier, but a chapter in a much larger human endeavor. The attempt to map reality while knowing that the map will always lag behind the territory. And this recognition does not diminish the search, but dignifies it, situating Caddy within a lineage of questions that have driven exploration, humility, and wonder across centuries. And in doing so, Part 9 prepares the ground for what comes next. Not an answer, but a deeper reckoning with how far we are willing to follow evidence without demanding that it lead us somewhere familiar. Part 10 enters a quieter, more introspective register, as if the narrative itself senses the weight of what has accumulated and chooses to slow its breathing. Because after comparison, convergence, and historical framing, the proof is out there now turns toward absence, not as a failure, but as a phenomenon worthy of study in its own right. And this part is built around a deceptively simple question. What does it mean when something leaves no clear trace? And how do humans interpret silence when they are conditioned to expect signals? And the episode opens with long stretches of stillness, wide shots of water without commentary, the camera lingering far longer than television convention would normally allow. And this creative choice is not indulgent, but instructive, forcing the viewer to confront the fact that most of the ocean's story is told without spectacle, without constant movement, and that meaning often hides in patience rather than action. And from this stillness, the episode unfolds its central theme, the epistemology of absence, the study of what is not found and how that not finding is interpreted. And philosophers and scientists alike explain that absence is rarely neutral. It is shaped by expectation, by methodology, by where and how one looks. And the show uses Caddy as a focal point for this broader inquiry. Because few mysteries have been so persistently present through reports, and yet so persistently absent through definitive capture. And rather than framing this as contradiction, Part 10 frames it as tension, a dynamic state that reveals the limits of certain investigative paradigms. And marine scientists discuss how absence of evidence in open systems like oceans differs fundamentally from absence in closed systems, because detection probability is uneven, shaped by depth, turbidity, movement, and sheer scale. And this technical discussion grounds the philosophical argument, reminding viewers that silence does not always equal emptiness. And the episode deepens this point by examining how monitoring technologies privilege certain kinds of presence over others, favoring organisms that vocalize frequently, surface predictably, or leave chemical signatures that persist. And if a hypothetical creature were adapted specifically to minimize these traces through deep diving, limited surfacing, or seasonal movement, it could remain effectively invisible to standard surveys. And this possibility is presented not as speculation, but as a logical extension of known biological strategies, reinforcing the idea that invisibility can be adaptive rather than accidental. And as the narrative unfolds, it turns toward case studies where absence delayed recognition, species known only through indirect signs for decades before confirmation. And these examples serve not as promises, but as calibrations, adjusting the viewer's sense of what absence can mean in scientific contexts. And the episode carefully balances this by also examining cases where prolonged absence ultimately indicated non-existence, reinforcing that patience alone is not proof. And this balance is crucial because it preserves the series' credibility, demonstrating that openness does not require optimism, only rigor. And the show returns repeatedly to the idea that methods shape outcomes, that searching for Caddy with tools designed for other questions may yield predictable silence. And this insight reframes the search, not as a binary success or failure, but as an iterative process of refinement, learning how to ask better questions of the environment. And as the episode progresses, it explores the psychological impact of prolonged absence on investigators and communities, the fatigue that sets in when nothing happens, the quiet doubt that erodes motivation, and the temptation to either abandon the search or harden belief in response. And psychologists explain how humans are uncomfortable with prolonged ambiguity, how the mind seeks resolution, either through closure or conviction. And Part 10 treats this discomfort with empathy, acknowledging how difficult it is to remain suspended between positions without sliding into certainty on either side. And this emotional realism grounds the abstract discussion, reminding viewers that inquiry is a human endeavor shaped by limits of attention and endurance. And the show illustrates this through personal reflections from researchers who stepped away from the caddy question not because they concluded it was false, but because the absence became too heavy, draining resources and focus. And these departures are framed not as defeats, but as natural cycles within long-term investigation, moments when curiosity yields to practicality. And this framing normalizes withdrawal as part of honest inquiry rather than evidence of failure. And as the episode continues, it examines how absence is communicated to the public, how headlines often translate inconclusive searches into definitive statements, found nothing, no evidence, debunked. And the show critiques this linguistic flattening, explaining how nuance is lost in translation and how this loss fuels polarization, with believers interpreting silence as suppression and skeptics interpreting it as disproof. And Part 10 positions itself as an attempt to reclaim nuance, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing without rushing to label it. And this effort is reinforced by the episode's pacing, which resists dramatic beats in favor of accumulation, letting small observations build slowly. And one particularly striking sequence involves the analysis of environmental noise, how shipping, sonar, and industrial activity create constant acoustic clutter that can mask biological signals. And this discussion adds an ecological dimension to absence, suggesting that some forms of silence are manufactured, not by intention, but by consequence. And this insight subtly expands the moral landscape of the mystery, implicating modern activity in our inability to hear what might be there. And the episode does not dwell on blame, but on awareness, highlighting how changes in ocean soundscapes complicate detection and interpretation. And as the narrative draws connections between absence and responsibility, it returns to the idea that not finding something can still be informative, revealing constraints, blind spots, and unintended effects of human presence. And in this way, Caddy functions as a probe, testing the sensitivity of our instruments and the humility of our assumptions. And the truncated title once again echoes, now feeling almost meditative, an unfinished thought that mirrors the open-endedness of absence itself. And the voiceover speaks quietly about listening differently, about attuning to what is not immediately apparent. And this metaphor extends beyond the mystery, inviting viewers to consider how absence operates in other domains, relationships, histories, environments, and how meaning is often inferred from what is missing as much as from what is present. And as Part 10 approaches its conclusion, the episode returns to the water at night, darker than before, the surface reflecting faint lights from distant shorelines. And this imagery reinforces the theme that visibility is relative, shaped by perspective and proximity. And the final reflections emphasize that absence does not end inquiry, but redirects it, shifting focus from capture to context, from proof as object to proof as pattern. And this shift feels like a maturation of the series' argument, moving beyond the question of whether Caddy exists toward a deeper exploration of how knowledge is constructed, maintained, and sometimes constrained by silence. And as the screen fades, the viewer is left with a paradox that feels less frustrating than before, the idea that not knowing can be informative, that absence can sharpen attention rather than dull it, and that the mystery of Caddy persists not despite silence, but partly because of it, sustained by the space between what is seen and what is expected. And in that space, inquiry continues slower, quieter, but perhaps more honest than ever before. Part 12 functions as the final resonance rather than a conclusion, a slow and deliberate settling of ideas that have been layered across the entire narrative, and it opens with an acknowledgement that endings themselves are human constructs, conveniences imposed on processes that rarely stop simply because a story does, and this awareness shapes the tone of the episode from its first moments. as the proof is out there approaches closure not as an answer, but as a reflection on why the question of Caddy the Cadborosaurus has endured with such resilience. And the narrator frames this part as an examination of legacy. Not the legacy of a creature necessarily, but the legacy of inquiry, of how certain mysteries persist because they adapt to the intellectual and cultural climates that encounter them. And this adaptive quality becomes the central theme of Part 12. As the episode traces how the Caddy narrative has shifted across decades, absorbing new technologies, new scientific paradigms, and new media ecosystems without losing its core tension. And this persistence is presented not as evidence of truth or falsehood, but as evidence of relevance, a sign that the question continues to intersect with unresolved aspects of human understanding. And the episode begins by revisiting the earliest archival material once more, not to reanalyze details, but to observe how the footage feels different now, filtered through everything the viewer has learned. And this return creates a sense of temporal layering, the past seen through the lens of accumulated context. And the narrator notes how meaning is not static but relational, changing as frameworks change. And this observation sets the stage for the episode's deeper inquiry into how mysteries evolve alongside the societies that host them. And historians discuss how certain unanswered questions function as cultural mirrors, reflecting prevailing anxieties, hopes, and assumptions. And in the case of Caddy, these reflections include humanity's evolving relationship with nature, from domination and classification toward coexistence and uncertainty. And this shift is traced through language, showing how early reports framed the creature as a threat or anomaly, while later discussions emphasize ecological integration and restraint. And this linguistic evolution reveals broader changes in worldview, suggesting that the mystery has been shaped as much by cultural maturity as by empirical investigation. And as Part 12 unfolds, it explores the idea that some phenomena resist closure because closure would reduce their utility as spaces for collective thought, and philosophers argue that unresolved questions serve as intellectual commons, places where different disciplines and perspectives can meet without the pressure of final agreement. And Caddy is presented as one such commons, a site of ongoing dialogue rather than a problem to be solved once and discarded. And this framing subtly redefines success, suggesting that the value of the investigation lies not in proving or disproving existence, but in sustaining rigorous, open-ended engagement. And this idea is reinforced through interviews with educators who use the Caddy case as a teaching tool, not to advocate belief, but to demonstrate critical thinking, evidentiary standards, and epistemic humility. And these educators emphasize how the mystery invites students to grapple with uncertainty constructively, learning to weigh claims without rushing to dismissal or acceptance. And this pedagogical dimension expands the impact of the narrative, showing how unresolved questions can cultivate intellectual resilience. And the episode then turns toward the future, examining emerging technologies that may further transform the search, advancements in autonomous underwater vehicles, machine learning-driven pattern recognition, and environmental DNA analysis. And scientists discuss how these tools could dramatically increase observational capacity, yet they also caution that more data does not automatically yield clarity, emphasizing the importance of interpretation, context, and restraint. And this caution echoes earlier themes, reinforcing that technology amplifies inquiry but does not replace judgment. And the episode deliberately avoids speculation about imminent discovery, instead focusing on how these tools will change the nature of not knowing, potentially shifting absence from a vague state into a more precisely characterized one. And this distinction is subtle but important, suggesting progress without promising resolution. And as the narrative continues, it reflects on the emotional dimension of closure, acknowledging the human desire for definitive answers, for stories that end cleanly. And psychologists discuss how unresolved narratives can generate discomfort, but also foster creativity, curiosity, and tolerance for ambiguity. And Part 12 treats this ambivalence with respect, neither celebrating uncertainty uncritically nor portraying it as a failure, but presenting it as a condition to be managed thoughtfully. And this balanced approach is reflected in the episode structure, which alternates between forward-looking discussion and inward reflection, allowing space for both anticipation and acceptance. And the narrator returns to the truncated title one final time, explaining that its incompleteness was intentional from the beginning. A reminder that some stories are always mid-sentence, and this explanation feels less like a reveal than a confirmation of what the viewer has already sensed, and the title becomes a metaphor for inquiry itself, perpetually reaching forward, never fully resolved. And as Part 12 moves toward its final passages, it gathers voices one last time, not to summarize, but to resonate, brief reflections from scientists, witnesses, skeptics, and storytellers, each articulating what staying with a mystery has meant to them. And these reflections converge on themes of patience, humility, and attentiveness, suggesting that the greatest shift produced by the investigation is not external but internal, a recalibration of how one engages with the unknown. And the episode emphasizes that this shift is transferable, applicable beyond the specific case of Caddy to any domain where evidence is incomplete and certainty elusive, and this universality elevates the narrative, transforming a specific inquiry into a meditation on knowledge itself. And visually, the episode returns to the ocean one final time. But now the imagery is neither dramatic nor foreboding. Instead, it is calm, expansive, and indifferent, reinforcing the idea that nature does not respond to human narratives, existing on its own terms regardless of our questions. And the narrator speaks quietly about coexistence with uncertainty, about learning to ask better questions rather than demanding final answers. And this message feels earned, grounded in the discipline demonstrated throughout the series. And as the final moments unfold, the episode refrains from any hint of revelation. No sudden sighting, no dramatic twist, and this restraint is deliberate, honoring the integrity of the inquiry. And the screen fades not to silence, but to ambient sound, waves, wind, distant echoes, suggesting continuity rather than conclusion. And the last words spoken emphasize that the proof is out there is not a promise, but an invitation to remain curious, skeptical, and open simultaneously. And with that, the narrative releases the viewer back into the world, carrying the question forward rather than closing it. And in this release, the mystery of Caddy the Cadborosaurus remains unresolved but transformed, no longer a test of belief, but a practice of attention, a reminder that understanding often grows not from answers, but from the quality of the questions we are willing to live with over time. And in this sense, the story does not end. It simply pauses, leaving space for whatever comes next, whether discovery, reinterpretation, or continued silence, all of which are now framed not as disappointments, but as part of an ongoing relationship with the unknown.